Imagine a galaxy where humans were nothing more than a legend, a whispered myth passed between alien civilizations. Stories of creatures who defied the odds, who thrived in environments no other species could endure, a race that had vanished from history before they could ever be truly known. Some believed they had been wiped out by their own recklessness. Others dismissed the idea entirely. Humans were just another wild tale, like the ancient fables of gods and monsters. But myths have a way of becoming real. And when the fleets arrived, the galaxy finally understood the terrifying truth. Humanity had never disappeared. They had been watching. And now, they were here. For centuries, the Galactic Union believed. It had mapped every intelligent species, every known power in the cosmos. Great empires rose and fell, alliances were forged and broken. But through it all, one unshakable truth remained. Humanity was fiction. There were no records, no ruins, no artifacts, only fragmented mentions in the archives of long-extinct civilizations. The few scholars who dared to investigate found themselves ridiculed. Ghosts don't build starships, they were told. Legends don't send emissaries. And yet something strange kept happening. Drifting wreckage found at the edges of uncharted space, technology that did not match any known species. Faint signals, always on the very limits of detection, encoded in an unknown language. Trade vessels would report impossible encounters. Ships that appeared out of nowhere, lingered just out of reach, and then vanished without a trace. Some dismissed it as sensor malfunctions. Others feared it was something worse. Something unknown. Something ancient. But the idea that it could be human? That was beyond absurd. Until the day the sky darkened over Tarsus Prime. Tarsus Prime. The proud jewel of the Union, a thriving world home to trillions. Its defenses were considered impenetrable, its fleets unmatched. When the first alerts came in, the authorities dismissed them as errors, a malfunction, a trick of deep space anomalies. But then the anomalies started moving, converging. Within moments, the orbital defenses detected an armada. Ships larger than anything in the Union's records, their signatures unlike anything ever seen. The Senate scrambled for answers. Who were they? What did they want? Every attempt to communicate was met with silence. The fleet simply advanced, methodical, unyielding. It wasn't until the first ship entered visual range that the horror truly set in. The markings on its hull were unmistakable, the language long thought to be extinct. Terran. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. Panic erupted across the planet. The Senate convened in emergency session. Military leaders scrambled to make sense of the impossible. Humanity was real. They had not vanished. They had not been lost to time. They had been waiting. And now, for reasons no one could yet understand, they had come back. But were they here as liberators or conquerors? Tarsus Prime had stood for thousands of years as the beating heart of the Galactic Union, a center of trade, diplomacy, and military power. It was home to the Union's greatest minds, its most advanced technology, and an orbital fleet capable of repelling entire armadas. And yet, all of it, the centuries of security, the arrogance of dominance, meant nothing when the unknown fleet arrived. The skies above Tarsus Prime darkened with the sheer scale of the approaching force. There were thousands of ships, each one bristling with unfamiliar weaponry, their hulls lined with blackened scars from battles fought beyond the reach of the Union's knowledge. They did not respond to hails. They did not acknowledge warnings. They did not slow their approach. Union High Command scrambled to react, but the situation defied logic. The last time an unknown force had breached Union space, it had been the Zarvanti invasion, and even they had taken years of probing before striking. This was different. This was immediate. This was planned. The order was given. Mobilize the planetary defense grid. Warships surged from their orbital docks, forming a defensive perimeter. Fighters screamed into the upper atmosphere, locking onto their targets. Tarsus Prime would not be caught unprepared. But before a single shot was fired, The largest of the invading vessels took position above the planet's capital. And it spoke. A voice, transmitted across every frequency in every known language. We were forgotten. We were erased. Now, we return. The words sent a ripple of fear through the Union's command structure. Not because of their meaning, but because of how they were spoken. The voice was deep, controlled, perfectly enunciated, entirely, unmistakably, human. For the first time in recorded history, the Union knew fear. Historians had long debated the possibility of humanity. Theories had been spun in academic circles, debated over centuries. Some believed they had once been a powerful race, an empire that had risen and fallen before the Union's founding. Others dismissed them as mere fiction, an exaggerated ghost story. But this was reality. The myths were real. The legends were standing in orbit, looking down on them with unknown intentions. Inside the Senate chambers, chaos erupted. Politicians shouted over one another, demanding answers that no one could provide. How was this possible? Where had humanity been hiding? And most terrifying of all, what did they want? Then, without warning, the first human warship made its move. A single vessel detached from the fleet and descended toward the surface, its hull glowing red-hot as it pierced through the planet's atmosphere. The Union Defense Forces locked onto it immediately, tracking its descent with every weapon at their disposal. If this was an invasion, they would make humanity bleed for every inch. But the ship did not attack. It did not engage in any hostile action. Instead, it landed, right in the heart of the capital. The hull hissed as it cooled, steam rising from the ship's armored plates. Its design was unfamiliar, sleek, utilitarian, built for function over form. The insignia on its side was worn but unmistakable, an ancient symbol buried in the deepest vaults of Union history. A Terran eagle, wings outstretched. The landing ramp lowered, and the world held its breath. From the depths of the vessel, a figure emerged. Humanoid. Clad in black armor, its surface, battle-scarred and engraved with symbols lost to time, it stepped forward with deliberate confidence, helmeted gaze scanning the terrified crowd that had gathered. Then, in the eerie silence, it removed its helmet, revealing a face that should not exist. A human. With piercing eyes, features hardened by war, and a presence that radiated authority, the figure looked upon the gathered aliens and smiled. The myths had come to life. But why? Was this a reunion? A warning? A reckoning? The Union was about to find out. For what felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence that gripped the capital of Tarsus Prime was not the silence of diplomacy, nor the anticipation of an honored guest. It was the silence of an empire standing at the precipice of the unknown. Before them stood a creature of myth, a specter of history come to life, a human in the flesh. He stood tall, unshaken by the thousands of eyes locked onto him. His armor, though battered, spoke of battles that none in the Union could even begin to comprehend. His face bore the unmistakable marks of age and experience, the kind only earned through lifetimes spent in war. And yet, despite the fear he inspired, there was something unnerving about his presence. It was not aggression. It was not hostility. It was something far worse. It was confidence. The kind of confidence that only came from absolute certainty. Certainty in power. Certainty in purpose. This was not an emissary who had come to negotiate. This was something else entirely. The gathered senators, generals, and civilians alike felt the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Here, standing before them, was the answer to a question that had lingered for millennia. What had happened to humanity? Had they gone extinct? Had they fled the galaxy? Had they been nothing more than a legend? Now they knew. Humanity had not died. It had not vanished. It had been watching, waiting, preparing. The human took another step forward. The alien guards, clad in advanced combat armor, raised their weapons instinctively, reflexively, though every single one of them knew, deep down, that it would do no good. Whatever this being represented, whatever lay behind the shadows of history, it was beyond their ability to control. Finally, The High Chancellor of the Union, an aged and weathered being with centuries of leadership behind him, gathered his courage and spoke. His voice, amplified across the city, carried a mix of trepidation and authority. "Who are you?" The human's gaze flickered toward him, unreadable and unshaken. And then, with a voice that echoed through the still air, he answered, "We are the Forgotten." The words sent a chill through the crowd. They were simple, yet carried a weight that no one could fully grasp. But before anyone could respond, he continued. "For centuries, we were cast into the void. Our history erased, our existence denied. Your ancestors feared what they could not understand, so they buried us. They called us dangerous, uncontrollable. And so, they turned their backs on us." His expression darkened, his voice sharpening. "But we never forgot." A murmur rippled through the Senate. The implications were clear. This was no accident. Humanity had been erased deliberately. Not by war, not by natural disaster, but by intent. Someone had tried to erase them from history. The High Chancellor, his voice laced with both curiosity and unease, pressed forward. "If what you say is true, if your people were cast into the void, then where have you been? How have you survived all this time?" The human's lips curled into the ghost of a smile, but there was no warmth in it. Only something cold. Something measured. "Where we have been does not matter. What matters is that we have returned. We have watched your union spread, conquering and assimilating in the name of peace. We have seen how you dictate which species are allowed to thrive, and which are left to die." His eyes swept across the gathered elite, his voice growing heavier with each word. "We saw, and we remembered." The silence that followed was suffocating. The implications of his words sank in like a slow-acting poison. Humanity had been there, in the shadows of history, watching, listening, learning. And now, after all this time, they had chosen to reveal themselves. The High Chancellor's mind raced. If the human was telling the truth, if the Union had played a role in humanity's disappearance, then this was no chance encounter. This was not a diplomatic visit. This was something far worse. This is a misunderstanding," the Chancellor said, choosing his words carefully. "The Galactic Union has always welcomed new civilizations, always sought peace. If there was wrongdoing in the past, it was not at the hands of this generation. Surely we can come to an understanding." For the first time, the human laughed. It was not a laugh of amusement, nor of joy. It was a sound laced with the weight of centuries, of loss, of anger, of something ancient and unforgiving. An understanding? He took another step forward, and despite the lack of visible weapons, the guards tensed. "When your ancestors erased us from history, did they seek an understanding?" He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "No. This is not a misunderstanding." Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his arm, and the sky above Tarsus Prime shifted. The great warships that had hovered silently in orbit moved in unison, their formations tightening, their presence no longer passive. Energy signatures spiked across the planetary defense grid as automated systems scrambled to track the unknown fleet. The Union's finest warships, its most advanced military installations, suddenly seemed small. And then, as if the final weight of reality had just fallen onto the shoulders of the Union's leaders, the human spoke again. "We did not come for war," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "But make no mistake. If war is what you choose, then war is what you will have." He turned his gaze skyward, watching as his people moved into position. "You buried us in the darkness." He looked back at them, his expression unreadable. "Now we return, in the light." And with those words, the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Would the Union seek peace? Or had they just awoken an enemy they were never meant to face? The weight of the moment pressed down on the gathered elite like a planetary atmosphere crushing unprotected lungs. The humans stood unmoving, Yet his presence filled the vast Senate chamber more than any towering monument of their ancestors ever could. There was no deception in his words, no bluster, only the quiet, terrifying certainty of a species that had returned from the depths of history, not as beggars seeking recognition, but as architects of their own destiny. High Chancellor Torvald's mind raced through the possibilities, calculating the ramifications of this revelation with the precision of a quantum processor. A species, one thought to be a mere legend, had returned, not as a scattered remnant, but as an empire with warships that could shadow entire cities. More than that, they had remained hidden for centuries, unnoticed by the most advanced intelligence, networks in the known galaxy. That alone was a threat beyond measure. The silence had stretched long enough. The Chancellor drew a slow, deliberate breath, his body adapting to the unnatural weight of fear pressing down on him. Finally, he spoke. "If you do not seek war, then why have you come in force?" The human's piercing eyes held his gaze, unwavering. There was no arrogance there, no hunger for conquest, only something far more unnerving. Purpose. "Because we know the truth," the human said simply. "And so do you." A ripple of unease spread through the chamber. The assembled senators glanced at each other, at the generals standing rigid, with unreadable expressions, at the intelligence officers who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Truth. The word carried a weight far heavier than it should have. The Chancellor's voice remained measured, but a flicker of something very close to dread, lurked beneath his composed facade. What truth? The human's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. The truth of what was done to us. The words landed like a physical blow. "You claim that the Union cast your people into the void," the Chancellor pressed. "But there is no record, no evidence of such a crime." The human exhaled slowly, almost as if he had expected this answer. "That," he said, "is because those who feared us did not simply cast us out. They erased us." His voice hardened. "They wiped our history from your archives. They purged our name from every record. They ensured that no trace of our civilization remained within your great halls of knowledge." His eyes darkened. "They tried to make us a myth." A murmur of alarm spread through the Senate, whispers carrying across the vast chamber like the rising winds of a storm. It was an accusation unlike any before. And yet, deep in the archives, hidden in the oldest data vaults, there were whispers, unverified reports, suppressed documents from the founding days of the Union, records that had been locked away for so long that even the most powerful among them had forgotten they existed, until now. The Chancellor's hands curled into fists. His people prided themselves on knowledge, on diplomacy, on the careful weaving of interstellar politics. But this was a wound inflicted long before his time, a crime buried so deeply that even speaking of it now threatened to unearth secrets best left in the past. And yet this human, this impossible figure standing before them, had returned with those secrets in hand. "You expect us to believe," the Chancellor said carefully, "that an entire species, an empire, was erased yet still survived beyond our reach for centuries?" The human tilted his head slightly. "Yes." Another silence, this one heavier than the last. A senator, his voice sharp with disbelief, spoke up from the gallery. "This is madness. The Union would never—" The human moved. It was a subtle shift, a mere step forward, but the entire chamber felt it like the gravitational pull of a collapsing star. The guards, trained and disciplined, clenched their weapons tighter. The senators inhaled sharply, and then, without another word, the human lifted a small device from his belt and activated it. The chamber darkened as a projection filled the air above them, a flickering feed of an ancient transmission. The image, distorted by the ages, revealed a council of figures in ceremonial robes, Union founders, long dead and forgotten. The recording crackled, then spoke. "They are dangerous," an elder voice declared. "Too powerful, too unpredictable. If we allow them to rise, they will challenge our rule." A second voice, deeper, more measured, responded. "Their minds, their advancements, they outpace every species we have ever encountered. If they are allowed to remain, it is only a matter of time before they reshape the balance of power." A pause. Then, a third voice. Then we make a choice. Not war, not diplomacy. We erase them. We rewrite history itself. It is the only way to ensure the Union's future. The recording ended. Silence. This was no fabrication. No forged data. This was history. A history the galaxy was never meant to remember. The High Chancellor's composure shattered. His voice, once controlled and deliberate, now trembled. This cannot be. But it was. The human deactivated the device, allowing the silence to settle once more. "We were never myths," he said, his voice quiet, yet deafening in the stillness. "We were betrayed." He looked up, beyond the domed chamber, toward the heavens where his fleet loomed like silent judges. "And now, we have returned." The meaning was clear. The question that had haunted the galaxy for generations had been answered. The myths were real. The lost had returned, and the Galactic Union was no longer in control of its own history. The tides of power were shifting. The only question left was whether the Union would accept the truth, or perish beneath it. The orbital sensors barely had time to register the shift before reality itself seemed to distort. A colossal void, a ship larger than any Union record had ever catalogued, emerged from the blackness of space. It did not arrive in the traditional sense. It simply was not there one moment, and then was the next, as though it had been lurking in the folds of existence, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Its design was alien even to the humans and their allies, a monstrous construct of interwoven metals and shifting, living circuitry. Its hull shimmered with an abyssal darkness that consumed all light. Every sensor, every scanning system, every technology designed to interpret and classify ships failed when directed at it. It had no energy signature, no identifiable structure, only its silhouette against the burning remains of the Union's defenses. The battlefield grew silent. Even the human admiral, Kale as he had called himself, paused in his command, his forces suddenly hesitating as the realization set in. And then, from deep within that leviathan of unknowable technology, came a single transmission. A voice, if it could even be called that. It did not speak in words. It did not transmit through conventional means. Instead, it was felt, an intrusion into the minds of every being in the system. Witness. That was all it said, and then, the ship moved. It did not fire weapons, because it had no need to. The moment its presence had been felt, something changed. Union ships, those still desperately fighting for their survival, simply ceased to function. Their reactors went cold. Their engines failed. Crews, trapped inside, screamed as they drifted helplessly toward the gravity well of their own dying world. And the humans? The exiles? They too were forced to pause, because whatever had just arrived, it was not part of their plan. It was something older, something deeper. Torva, still gripping the edge of the Senate Hall's grand balcony, watched in horror, as the colossal ship simply existed, its presence sending ripples through space-time itself. The human beside him, the one who had delivered their fate with unwavering certainty, now showed something different in his eyes. Recognition, understanding, and, for the first time, fear. "What is that?" Torva whispered. The humans swallowed. "We thought we were the only ones who had been erased," he said. His voice was quiet, lost in the chaos around them. "But we were wrong." Torva turned, eyes wide. The human finally looked at him, his expression devoid of the cold confidence he had carried moments before. "There's something else," he said. "Something older than all of us." The sky cracked, a pulse of darkness swept through the system, and everything changed. The battle, the war, the revenge of the forgotten, it all became insignificant in the face of what had now awakened, and, as the capital world of the Galactic Union burned, as the exiled coalition prepared for their final act of vengeance, the truth settled in. They were all myths, every species, every empire, every war ever fought. And now, something older than myth had returned, something that had never been forgotten, because it had never been allowed to be known. The last words spoken before the transmission cut off were from the human. Admiral's flagship, his voice, barely above a whisper, carried through the static. They were here before us. And then, all signals went dark. The last great war of the Union had just become something far greater than anyone had ever imagined. A war not of vengeance, but of survival. And the myths of the past would not matter anymore. Because a new legend was beginning, one that no one would live to tell. The sight defied comprehension. At first, it was difficult to discern the true scale of the vessels that loomed just beyond the outer sectors. The human ships were unlike anything in the Union's records. Monolithic titans of war, forged in the darkness of unknown space. Their hulls, black as the abyss, were laced with veins of golden light, their surfaces shifting with intricate patterns that pulsed like living entities. But they were not alone. Beyond them, emerging from the void like phantoms of a forgotten age, were ships of a different design. Colossal constructs of alien craftsmanship. Ships that bore the unmistakable marks of civilizations long thought lost to time. Torva's breath hitched. He recognized them. The ghost fleets. The exiled. Empires. Legends that had been dismissed as fables. The Senate chamber was now deathly quiet, the weight of what they were witnessing pressing down on them like a black hole consuming all hope. The Security Council's most senior officer, a hardened warrior from the Ralcon species, finally found his voice, though it trembled with disbelief. This is impossible, he said, his crest flattened against his skull. These species vanished long before the Union was even formed. They were erased, the human finished for him. His gaze remained locked on the holoscreen where the massive fleet continued its slow, deliberate advance. Much like you tried to erase us, Torva's mind raced. The implications were staggering. The Galactic Union had always assumed itself the pinnacle of civilization. They had built their empire upon the ruins of lesser species, expanding across the stars, unchallenged for millennia. But what if they had been wrong? What if those they had thought long dead had never truly disappeared? What if they had simply been waiting for the right moment to return? A fresh transmission cut through the static, and this time it was not from Union forces. A new image filled the holoscreen, a figure, shrouded in the shadows of an unfamiliar warship's command deck. Its form was humanoid, but its armor was unlike anything seen before, an intricate blend of ancient design and advanced technology. When it spoke, the voice was distorted, as if it carried the echoes of countless generations. This is Admiral Kale of the Exiled Coalition. The title sent a jolt through the Senate. No such coalition had ever existed in their records. We have returned to claim what was stolen. Your dominion over the stars is over. Torva's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a human rebellion. This was an uprising of the forgotten, the avenged. The chamber spiraled into a frenzy. Some senators clamored for negotiation, others demanded an immediate military response, while a few simply sat in stunned silence, unable to process what was unfolding. Torva turned back to the human, his voice barely above a whisper. You planned this. The human did not deny it. This was always going to happen, he said. You built your union on the bones of those who came before. Did you truly think the dead would remain silent forever? A new alarm blared. This one deeper, more urgent. It was a warning reserved only for one scenario. Invasion. Multiple vessels entering planetary orbit, a voice cried through the comms. Defensive grids are being overwhelmed. We can't. The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Above the capital world, the first shots were fired. And as the Senate chamber erupted into chaos, as the Galactic Union's leaders realized they were no longer the masters of the stars, the human finally delivered his last words. You called us a myth. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of entire civilizations. But myths have a way of becoming legends. Outside, the sky burned. The war drums of the forgotten pounded across the void. The capital world of the Galactic Union, once the heart of an empire that spanned thousands of systems, was now under siege. Above its atmosphere, the fleet of the exiled, the erased, and the avenged descended in force. The defensive systems of the Union, proud and arrogant in their supposed invulnerability, were breaking under the sheer weight of firepower unleashed by the returning ghosts of history. Massive planetary defense stations, once thought indestructible, cracked apart as kinetic rounds the size of skyscrapers slammed into them. Entire orbital platforms, fortified with generations of security measures, were torn from their moorings and sent spiraling into the burning atmosphere below. The capital's defensive fleet, numbering in the hundreds, was being overwhelmed in mere minutes. Their formations collapsed as the exiled coalition, an armada composed of human warships and the vessels of ancient, long-thought-extinct species, tore through their ranks with surgical precision. And then, as if the universe itself sought to etch this moment into history, the heavens above the capital world split open. A new presence arrived, something darker, something even the exiled feared. Torva nodded slowly, though every fiber of his being screamed that he would not like the answer. The human turned his gaze upward, toward the towering skylight above them, where beyond the shimmering force fields, the vastness of space stretched endlessly. And in that endless black, hidden just beyond the sight of the civilian population, waited the fleet. He spoke, his words final. We did not return alone. The meaning slammed into the room like a kinetic impact. The Galactic Union had long feared war, had built its defenses, had stationed its fleets across countless sectors. But those fleets had always been positioned against each other, against rogue elements, against piracy. They had never prepared for something else, something new, something unknown. And if what the human was implying was true, then the myths of humanity were not the only legends that had been forgotten. A siren blared suddenly, a sharp, piercing wail that sent a shockwave of alarm through the chamber. Emergency systems activated. The security guards at the edge of the room snapped to attention, their weapons drawn. A voice crackled through the high-priority communication feeds, urgent and breathless. Chancellor, we have multiple contacts emerging from beyond the outer sectors. The transmission faltered. Then, after a moment of agonizing silence, it resumed. By the gods, they're not alone. The human's expression remained unchanged. He had known. From the moment he had stepped into the chamber, he had known. And as the realization dawned upon the assembled senators, as their faces twisted in horror at the magnitude of what was happening, the human finally smiled. The past had returned, and the future would never be the same. The weight of realization struck the Galactic Union's senators like a gravity well pulling them into an inescapable truth. Humanity had returned, but they were not alone. The sirens wailed, red emergency lights bathed the chamber in an ominous glow, and the communications feed crackled with updates that only deepened the terror gripping the assembly. The security forces, highly trained and disciplined, moved to defensive positions around the chamber, their weapons primed, their eyes scanning every shadow for threats. But no amount of firepower would change the reality that unfolded beyond the grand skylight of the Senate Hall. High Chancellor Torva forced himself to breathe, forced himself to steady the tremor in his claws as he turned toward the human, whose calm, unwavering expression sent shivers down his spine. The human had known. He had stood before them, revealing the past they had long buried, knowing that this was only the beginning. Torva's throat felt constricted as he forced out the words, Who else is out there? The human did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the edge of the grand observation balcony, his boots echoing against the polished floors. Beyond the glass, the vast sprawl of the Galactic Union's capital. City stretched into the horizon. Massive towers of shimmering steel and energy. Orbital stations humming with power. Billions of citizens moving through their daily lives, oblivious to the storm that was about to engulf them. The human exhaled, then finally spoke. You spent centuries erasing us from history. His voice was measured, yet it carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something final. You turned us into myths, whispers in the void, stories told to frighten children. You thought you had seen the last of us. He turned, his eyes burning with an intensity that silenced even the most defiant senators. But the galaxy is far older than your union, and you are not the only ones who have forgotten what came before. A deep, rumbling impact shook the chamber. The reinforced glass vibrated, and a pulse of energy rippled through the city beyond. The senators stiffened, their eyes darting between one another in growing panic. The communication feeds lit up once more, voices overlapping in frantic reports. Unidentified vessels emerging from subspace. They're massive. Their energy signatures don't match any known database. By the stars. They're human! The chamber erupted in shock. Torva's claws clenched against the railing. It was impossible. Humanity had been extinct, annihilated, purged from existence by the very union that now stood trembling at their return. The remnants of their people, if any had survived, should have been nothing more than scattered exiles, broken and insignificant. And yet, they are more than human, the human standing before them said. The room fell silent once more. The holoscreens flickered, and the first images of the fleet appeared. The Union's military command had hijacked the Senate's displays, projecting live footage from the orbital sensors. The weight of revelation crushed the Senate chamber like the unrelenting pull of a neutron star. The truth, long buried beneath layers of deception, had been unearthed. Not as a whisper, not as a conspiracy, but as a stark and undeniable fact. The air itself seemed charged, thick with the realization that everything they thought they knew had been a lie. The High Chancellor Torva could feel the eyes of his people upon him, waiting, demanding a response. His throat was dry, his carefully composed facade splintering under the crushing reality of what the human had just exposed. To acknowledge this truth was to admit that their great galactic union was built upon a foundation of deceit, an atrocity so immense that it redefined everything. The chamber was in chaos. Dozens of senators broke into frantic conversation, their voices overlapping in an unrelenting cascade of horror, denial, and fury. Others remained motionless, staring at the darkened space where the transmission had played, the ghosts of the past reaching forward to shatter the illusion of innocence they had clung to for so long. But none of them mattered in this moment. Only the human. He stood there, watching them all, not gloating, not reveling in the turmoil he had caused. No, there was only the unyielding patience of a being who had waited for this moment far longer than any of them could comprehend. Finally, the silence broke, not from the Chancellor, but from one of the senior senators. A Zelvari elder, his silken robes trembling with barely restrained emotion, rose from his seat, his bioluminescent eyes burning with an intensity the chamber had not seen in centuries. "This," he rasped, his voice hoarse, "this is an abomination." Several senators nodded in fierce agreement, though their reasoning differed. Some outraged at the act of erasure itself, others outraged that the secret had come to light at all. But the elder senator wasn't finished. His four clawed fingers curled tightly against his seat as he spoke, his voice rising like a storm gathering momentum. "Our union has endured for millennia. We have brought peace, prosperity, order. And yet, we stand here today, forced to face a sin so monstrous that it threatens to undo all that we have built." He turned, his gaze falling upon the Chancellor, upon the assembled council members, and then, finally, upon the human. His next words were measured, but they cut deeper than any weapon ever could. "What will you do now?" The question was, not just for the human, it was for everyone, and yet, the human was the one who answered. "We have already done what we needed to." The chamber stiffened. A ripple of fear swept through the gathered officials. The Chancellor's voice, strained yet firm, found its way through the tension. "What do you mean?" The human exhaled slowly, deliberately. "You believe this revelation is your greatest problem," he said, his voice steady. "But it is not." The Chancellor's eyes narrowed. The human stepped forward, his presence growing larger, more suffocating. "You think we came here as petitioners, seeking justice for a forgotten crime?" His gaze swept over the gathered officials, dissecting them with an unnerving precision. "But we did not come to plead." The senators leaned in, their bodies stiff with apprehension. "We came because the galaxy is changing." The words sent a fresh wave of tension through the room. The human's expression remained unreadable as he continued. "For centuries, you have told yourselves that you are the center of civilization, that the Galactic Union is the pinnacle of order." He tilted his head slightly. "But the truth is that while you sat on your thrones, Wrapped in the illusion of stability, the universe continued without you. A senator, one of the more aggressive members of the Union's Defense Council, scoffed. We are the largest governing body in known space. We have dominion over thousands of worlds. How dare you? The human cut him off with a single glance. You are not as dominant as you believe. A chill settled over the room. Torva's mind was already racing, piecing together the implications. This wasn't just about justice. This wasn't just about history. The humans had returned, not just as a wronged species demanding answers, but as something more, something larger, something that had evolved beyond the galaxy's understanding. What are you saying? The Chancellor asked, though he already feared the answer. The human's lips pressed into a thin line. You asked why we came in force, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Why? After centuries in the shadows, we chose this moment to reveal ourselves.